Okay, very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Very happy to see you here for, well, one of the last sessions at the AEF. We have saved one of the most interesting regions really for renewables in Africa for last. We're talking today about East Africa, what I believe is arguably the most promising and the most exciting region for renewables across the continent. It's the region, of course, where we have first mover markets like Kenya that already ramped up a lot of renewables, including now what soon will be the largest wind farm on the whole continent with Lake Turkana. We have potentially very big markets like Ethiopia, like Tanzania, with spectacular resources. Of course, on the wind side, but very much so on the solar side. Geothermal resources are world-class. And then we have many smaller countries that are now actively looking at renewables. So I think a very vibrant, very exciting region that also faces huge challenges. We really have, in times, difficult environments for IPPs. Kenya is really the country where we've seen already IPP frameworks taking root, showing that they are financeable. But in some of the other countries, there's still some questions to be answered, really. What is the way forward? How would governments like to procure renewables? And what opportunities are there for private investors? To discuss these opportunities and the challenges that need to be addressed, we have a very distinguished panel with us today to shed some light on that. I will introduce our participants here. Starting on my right with the Commissioner, Engineer Nyamunga. He's Commissioner at the Energy Regulatory Commission of Kenya, so the regulator that takes a very active role in the rollout, the licensing of the Kenyan IPP projects, among others. Yeah. Then we have Anthony Hyde. He's International Sales Director for Exergy. Exergy is an Italian-based company working on something that's called the organic Rankine cycle. But Anthony will maybe go a little bit into detail to explain what this waste heat recovery system can do and what benefits it brings also to geothermal plants. Moving on, Unai Bravo, Business Development Director with Acciona. Unai is with Acciona Energy, so that's the IPP part of the large Acciona group. And as such, Unai is looking at various renewable energy technologies across all of sub-Saharan Africa. Then we have Koshak Ray. Koshak is a partner with Trinity International. It's a law firm that is focused on emerging markets and I think has a very strong reputation as one of the key legal experts on IPP and PPA structures and so on. So Koshak can guide us on some of these topics there. We have from Globeleq, Christian Bright. Christian has, I think, 2 decades of experience with IPP projects across various technologies, including conventional gas, but also renewables. Across Africa, did some large projects in Uganda, in Kenya, and Christian can share some of the experiences from these successful ventures. And then right on the left there, we have Dan Schulz. Dan is one of the co-founders of Frontier Energy, a Denmark-based developer that's also very active across a wide range of countries and markets and technologies. And I believe you've just been also making good progress on solar projects in Kenya, so maybe there's something you can share on that. Good. With those introductions, let's dive right in and maybe start with a bit of an overview. I've now, described a little bit the opportunities and risks. Myself, coming from Vestas, of course, I mean, we are a pure wind player. I'm working there on the sub-Saharan African markets. We see good opportunities for wind energy. We've installed 1,000 megawatt now across the continent, including the Lake Turkana plant in Kenya. But well, maybe my focus is a little bit limited on wind energy. Unai, maybe you can say a few words. What kind of opportunities do you see across East Africa, and looking also at solar and some of the other technologies?
Okay, Malte, thank you very much for the introduction. Mainly, okay, what I wanted to say is, as I told you, so Acciona Energy is focused on, especially on solar PV and wind opportunities. Regarding the wind opportunities, what we've seen is that we have different realities. Let's say the East African wind corridor is very interesting. So from the resource perspective, is a very attractive area. But then, at least as investors, what we look after is also about let's say the global framework of every specific country. So I would say we are talking about Africa and East Africa, and I think we should talk about the specific reality in each country, right? So Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania, they have different realities. So from our side, what we've tried especially is also because on the wind side, we have a large experience, so operating already around 7 gigawatts all around the world. So basically, we've tried to explore opportunities in Kenya through the feed-in tariff, and also in Tanzania there are some other opportunities. But on the other hand, also we are looking for, so we are waiting for the potential future tenders that the Ethiopian government might open maybe in around 1 year. So, but basically, for our biggest concern is basically let's say the bankability and feasibility of those projects from the investment perspective. And then the most important one is very difficult, and I think it would apply this situation to all the African market, is the reliability of the timing. I mean, it's very difficult to forecast because when those investments or when those tenders are gonna happen, because our experience is that I mean, we've suffered a lot of delays, so it's pretty difficult to understand, or at least to let's say to push for certain opportunities when basically the reality is that there are a lot of delays due to different factors.
Yes, thank you. You definitely already pointed to some of the challenges we are facing across the region. Timing, yes, the bankability. I think those topics we will also try to shed some more light on as we go through the different countries. Regarding the auctions, Christian, maybe you can share a bit of your expectations. There's been a lot of talk about the auctions in various countries. I mean, Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania have been now discussing upcoming auctions or even announced soon to be released tenders and so on. But not much has happened, though. What's your expectation on that?
What's my expectation? I'm trying to make this an authentic conversation. Well, I think the one thing we message, I mean, obviously Globeleq, we are competitive in tenders across the technologies. We also negotiate bilateral deals when that's the right thing for the country. What we say in a place like Ethiopia is we happily will compete in tenders. We bid for the Metahara 120 megawatt solar project. But that generally speaking, the auctions take a long time to set up, are the right, I think, long-term place for the countries to go. But often the process is rushed, the documents aren't well prepared, the competition varies widely, as is the benchmark to get in. So I think it's a good long-term strategy, but I think the countries need to be realistic. If they would like power on the grid faster, they need to negotiate while they work out a longer-term move to auctions. I think Kenya's in a really interesting space, moving from a negotiated deal like Lake Turkana that I was involved with when I worked for Oldwich, through to a feed-in tariff system where you have solar and wind set at a certain rate, and now signaling a move towards auctions, which I think is the right evolution. I think what Kenya, and the Commissioner may want to comment on it, but Kenya is now deciding where to draw the line at the feed-in tariffs, some which are amidst the pipeline, and how to move to auctions and when and how much power and what kind of power. So these are the big questions. Within the auction system, I'll just say one more thing about that. I guess the country needs to decide, do they want to do the South African model, where the developer finds the sites and gathers the data, or do they want to develop the site as the off-taker themselves and say, this is where you come and bid, more like the Zambia Scalian Solar or Metahara? I'm very much in favor of the former. I think the only people worse at getting land than private developers is the government.
Good. Yeah, I think it's a good point there that you say auctions will take some time to be really set up in a bankable way, and if you need power quickly, and most of the countries do, it's probably a good idea to run in parallel or give it some time and not stop with the bilateral PPA negotiations, as some of the countries, of course, have done. Right? Things were paused, and if the auction's not coming, then obviously nothing happens. Right? Then maybe, I mean, we will be talking quite a bit more on some of the big countries, Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania in a minute. Mm-hmm. But Frontier is also active really in a number of smaller countries that not everybody really has on the map. What kind of opportunities do you see there? Maybe also in looking at Uganda, at Rwanda, and these places.
I think the Ugandans would be grossly offended by being referred to as a smaller country in the East African context. But yes, both Uganda and Rwanda, we are quite active. Actually, if I may just comment on one thing in terms of what Christian just said, I think it's also on the auctioning technology is a really important factor, because small hydro don't lend themselves well to auctioning. Certainly geothermal, we've seen very bad examples of auctioning on geothermal. Menengai, for instance, comes to mind. Yep. And then on transitioning from feed-in tariff, I agree completely. This issue about legacy projects and preserving your brand name Kenya as a favorable destination to investors, balancing against the need for lower cost and all this, because a lot of people, including ourselves, have spent a lot of money developing projects in expectation of a certain defined tariff, or at least, somewhat defined tariff. So anyway, but our experience in the smaller markets, notably Uganda, where I've been extremely active recently, where we have 5, 6 hydropower stations. One has just been commissioned and 4 are in construction now. Where we are the equity provider and FMO are the lead senior debt provider. That has been an extremely positive experience. We basically 5 years ago we started with no bankable standard PPA. And because of GetFit coming in and because of quite a lot of interest, we were actually able to have a process together with KfW, but also with a lot of interaction from us, who were some of the first ones starting this, to have a joint process about getting to a standard PPA. And the last PPAs, and it was Trinity who was the law firm involved in that, and now we have a bankable PPA implementation agreement, set of direct agreements. And the last PPA negotiation I was in Uganda took 2 hours. And that was it. And it was initial, and now it's been signed. And so when people say, we shouldn't bother with these are for small projects, these are less than 10 megawatts or 20 megawatts, I think actually is the threshold. But when people say we shouldn't bother about these small SPPAs because it's not, you might as well look at it as one PPA for a 200 or 300 megawatt plant, because that's what's happened in Uganda. That's the amount of 100 megawatts coming in this way, and it's been remarkably efficient in procurement afterwards. So I think in my view, Uganda has one of the best regulated sectors in Africa, and you can also see they've climbed to the top of the Bloomberg New Energy listings or Climate Scope and all this. Yeah. Mm.
Yes. No, I think that's definitely something very interesting to have a 2-hour.
But there's not a lot of wind.
Unfortunately not. No,
mostly in hydro.
yes, indeed. I think it's very interesting what GetFit, but also Scaling Solar are doing and so on, that basically they advised the governments in creating and setting up the bankable framework right from the start. well, then in the end, I mean, save a lot of time on PPA negotiations, and which usually come well, you take your PPA maybe a little bit late to the banks. They say, oh, no, we're not going to finance this, please go back. And I think these programs actually start right there and give a lot of certainty then later in that process, right? Koshek, do you think that that is something that can be set up more? I mean, scaling solar, well, is obviously solar focused. GetFit is a little bit more on the smaller projects. Should we not be doing more also for other technologies and larger projects?
Yeah, absolutely. But I'd reiterate what Daniel has said, that GetFit Uganda has been a great success. I think it's 17 projects have closed. I think the target's around about 160 megawatts in total. And, obviously that's spread over a number of projects, but that's, in terms of time frame of delivery, it's really been a great success. I think certainly, ideally replicable on a larger scale. Obviously, IFC Scaling Solar is, as it says, it's a solar program. No reason why that can't be implemented on a larger scale. You obviously have more challenges where your resource is geothermal or wind to do it in that kind of program. I think the advantage of, and there's room for a GetFit and there's room for scaling solar. The advantage is that everything is pre-baked, so your implementation agreement, your PPA, your direct agreements, and largely also even on the financing side. So on GetFit Uganda, although that wasn't part of the package, would-be lenders were brought in to give their comments on documentation, and FMO, for example, is a lender to a very large number of those projects, so they can also just replicate documentation. GetFit Zambia was launched yesterday. That's the next place that GetFit's going to be rolled out. Again, it remains on the slightly smaller side, but across a number of technologies and not just limited to solar. I think scaling solar, I always believe that the proof is going to be in the pudding. So once deals have closed and closed in country, and there are obviously challenges in Zambia in the first round and in getting to close, I think they're very close, but there have been challenges along the way. I think that will end up being finessed as the second rounds go out in Zambia and as scaling solar gets rolled out elsewhere. But certainly what is key is having a procurement framework in place that is effectively pre-baked, ideally one that comes with financing, and absolutely no reason why it can't be across technologies in a larger scale.
Very good. Okay, let's with that maybe then focus a little bit more on Kenya. Commissioner, what is your expectation? I mean, we have Lake Turkana, of course, being now installed, hopefully soon connected to the grid. Yes. It will then contribute about 15% of current Kenyan demand. Mm-hmm. There's some talk in Kenya that, well, the market is full, it's a little bit saturated. What is your view? Are more renewables, are more IPP projects needed?
Yeah, in fact, my view is that you see, we are now working on East Africa integration in terms of power, so that when investors come, they don't come to do small units. They come to do large units. As much as we are now at 2,300 megawatts, which is slightly more than our demand. Our demand is about 2,000. But it is not really very reliable as at now. We are looking at a situation where the potential that we have now for 7,000 megawatts for geothermal, if we interconnect the 6 countries within East Africa, including Ethiopia, then an investor can come and do that 7,000 megawatts. And because it is very reliable and the tariff is relatively low, it will reduce the cost that we pay, both the domestic and industrial and commercial consumers, so that we make the cost of power relatively competitive, such that the industrial sector does not produce goods which are relatively expensive. So my wish, as much as now we have enough, but very soon from the projection, we shall be in need of like 5,000 megawatts in the next, I think it's 5 years or so. So we need an investor to come in geothermal, because geothermal is relatively reliable and relatively cheap in terms of tariff. So really, the investors that are here, that is a potential that those with interest can actually come and do it. Wind is there, yes, but you see, wind is intermittent in a way, just like solar. But you see, geothermal is express.
Very good. I think so. A very positive outlook on geothermal,
yes.
but also overall demand and the integration across the East African power
yes,
pool.
I would like to establish East African power pool. Eventually, it can even be Eastern Africa, which has about 10 countries, because that is also being thought about. So our focus as Kenya now is to see how we can have regional integration so that we have a big power pool that power is reliable, sustainable, and you can depend on it.
Anthony, good positive outlook there on geothermal. You, I guess, agree on the potential there. What has been your experience in Kenyan geothermals? Why has it been a success? And what do you see going forward there?
Thank you, Malte. And I think the Commissioner gave us a very good introduction there to the attraction of geothermal to the region. I think geothermal seems to be a little bit forgotten about at these conferences because it's seen as the heavy investment risk at the beginning. And I think if we look, first of all, geothermal is an attractive source of power because of its baseload capability. So for renewables, apart from hydro, it's really the only renewable which can give us that baseload production. In terms of Kenya, they now have more than 600 megawatts of geothermal in operation, and I think there's plans over the next few years to add another 600 megawatts. That's not without its challenges, and since I don't work for anyone in Kenya, I can say the country has struggled to achieve what it has so far achieved. And I think if we look at where there has been success and where there has been less success, we can look both at Kenya and we can look both worldwide and see that to develop geothermal successfully, the way that it has worked in Kenya is when there has been the ability to de-risk the initial investment. And I think that's what we have also seen worldwide. When a government steps in to take that drilling risk, to take the initial risk, then investors, developers are very, very happy to come in and quote, as the Commissioner mentioned, attractive tariffs on electricity production based on proven technologies for those projects. So I see a very bright future for geothermal in the region as a base load supplier of power, but it will continue to be the ignored technology unless the governments are willing to step in and guarantee those first risky investments are covered. To go on from that and to talk about a little bit about the type of technologies which we're seeing develop in those countries, it's the low-hanging fruit for geothermal is drilling which has already been completed. KenGen, as an example, has hundreds of unused wells, and maybe 20 years ago, developing those unused wells into power generation was not a technical possibility. But with the proliferation of organic Rankine cycle technology, which is the geothermal technology more suitable for lower temperature resources, we're now seeing that opportunity expand greatly. KenGen is currently out to tender for a modular power plant, a number of modular power plants for some existing wells. And in that tender, I think all of the competitive tenderers have used an element of organic Rankine cycle in those tenders. And we will see over the coming years, KenGen will look to utilize its resources far more effectively by utilizing the best technologies on the market. And that technology should really be spread out across the region, where people who have previously thought they have resources which are unsuitable for development are now economically capable of being developed and providing reliable power.
Could I ask a question? You have been in Kenya. I'm happy to hear that. Now, one of the other resources that we have is hydro. When you've done the exploration, how does the production of hydro compare with geothermal in Kenya in terms of the cost? Because what has happened in East Africa now is the weather is so unreliable that it's like the dams sometimes go so low that what you are expecting to generate, you don't generate. So what is your view in Kenya as far as hydro is concerned?
I'm not an expert in any way on hydropower and where it is applicable in terms of mini hydro and large hydro projects. My understanding is that in terms of levelized cost, geothermal is extremely competitive against hydro. I think a lot of the major hydro projects have been developed in the past, and therefore their costs now to operate are very, very low. So you have the opportunity that if you have developed hydro, then of course that is the cheapest form of power you can have. However, to develop new hydro is an expensive and complex business which takes both a lot of land and a lot of money. But I would, as I said, I'm not an expert, and I'll go to anybody else here, either on the panel or in the audience, to answer that more effectively.
Okay.
Good. Yeah. Well, I think that in the cost comparison, one always needs to take all costs into consideration, and I mean, de-risking geothermal drilling and so on, these investments would of course also need to be added to the bill. But then of course you have also very strong advantages that you pointed out. You have stable feed-in, both on the hydro side with the, of course, I mean, the precipitation variance, but geothermal being very stable there, and that of course represents a big value, right? But maybe looking at Kenya on the wind energy side, there's of course Lake Turkana that has been talked a lot about. Christian and Koshak, you have been both personally involved there in that many year of financial structuring. I think it's been, well, Vestas has been involved for 7 years. The initial development started 10 years ago. That's quite a journey, of course, but it represents a challenge in itself. You and I mentioned this timing. I mean, it's difficult also to sell internally, right, to your investment boards, to our management. Why are we spending so much focus on that over so many years? Lake Turkana now has shown it still can become a successful project. It closes then in the end. It's now the largest wind farm in Africa.
Yes.
But what is your lesson from that? I mean, is that now the way forward? I mean, will there be more Lake Turkanas? Can we make the process faster, or is it really too much of a special project? Is it not really to be replicated?
Shall I
go first?
have a crack at it? Yeah, sure. Well, I think, at least in my 20 years in the region, if you're going to do something, a landmark project like this, originally with AES, Bujagali from 1996, 1997, Landmark Hydro, we were not successful with. When I was with Oldwich, Lake Turkana was a very long-term deal, as you've mentioned, had the right fundamentals and the right political will behind it, which I think is fundamental for these big deals to happen. When I was with AES, we did Songas in Tanzania, which now, of course, Globeleq owns, so that's interesting the way things work. But those are projects which are few and far between, and we as developers, off-takers, and governments cannot rely on this degree of patience, this degree of tenacity much longer. So I don't know what the right answer is, but it is something, of course, the beauty of all these projects is you never know how long they're going to take. You never know how much they're going to cost, and if you ever did, you probably wouldn't do a single one of them. You get sort of pregnant, and then you just keep churning away. But I think East Africa has matured beyond this sort of innovative market. I think it now has to move into the right form of bilateral negotiations when it's geothermal or large hydro, the right form of get-fits when it's smaller scale, the right form of auctions when it's in between. And I think underpinning all of this has got to be the right sort of credit enhancement from the governments and off-takers in a clear way, the right degree of transparency, the right sort of documentation. We're trying to put Kaushik out of a job so he can retire.
Absolutely.
Get his documents up front in a bankable form. Don't give him any discretion in negotiating them later. And I think that in summary, the big question should no longer be, can we keep doing these large-scale projects, but can we do them better for all parties concerned? And I think we are moving towards that, at least in the case of Kenya and aspirations of Ethiopia, Tanzania. My mother's always told me, if you have nothing nice to say, say nothing at all. So that's where I'll leave it.
Dan, you had to comment on that?
Yeah, it was actually just on geothermal that Anthony mentioned, because we are a fairly large investor in a geothermal project called the Akira project, the 70-megawatt project in Kenya, south or around Naivasha, which is south of the Okaria, Kenyan area. And although you're right in the sense that it would be nice if somebody took drilling risk and then private sector could just come in, like let's say the intention was with the Menengai tenders. I think, frankly speaking, that's not the constraint, really, because in that project we had a very innovative insurance solution with a large European insurer actually covering at least a large degree of the drilling risk for us as a developer. And that made, let's say, the decision to drill exploration wells let's say, a palatable one, although it's kept us up and we still have a lot of sleepless nights over it. What is actually causing problems for that project is the lack of a GOK support letter. That is an integral part of the framework in Kenya, which has come off the wagon in the last 2 years because, well, primarily because of Kinangop, I suppose. At least that's one very objective event that one can point to as being the cause of the hesitation, understandable hesitation from government to sign the old GOK support letter, because that project is in arbitration, as most people. And that is holding back funding for us and not allowing us to proceed. Technically, the project is ready to go further, and we would love to go further. But before this is in place, it is extremely difficult for us, because without that, we have no view of full bankability. We have a signed PPA, but without that supporting document, yes, it's difficult. Yeah. So I just wanted to elaborate a little bit on this.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And I think the point there is it's about lessons learned. So Lake Turkana, or a project like Lake Turkana or like Bujagali, you could almost describe them as unicorn projects. Lake Turkana in particular is, the way it's been developed, the fact that it's a resource that was found almost by accident, really. That's not easily replicable. What is replicable is the fact that here's a project that secured 620 million euros worth of funding. Why has it managed to secure that? What has made it bankable? And what's made it bankable is a risk allocation in a PPA and a Government of Kenya support letter, where risks are allocated to the correct parties, what's seen as the correct parties for the sponsors and the lenders and government. To then roll back from that, and again, it's very understandable on Kinangop, there were land issues, local political issues, that central government will say, well, this really has nothing to do with us, we don't necessarily control this, and it's been unfortunate incidents. But looking at it from an investor's perspective, any type of political risk, whether it's local, whether it's central government, should sit within government. Now, yes, that is certainly a challenge, and I can understand very much why government doesn't want to take on that type of risk, but that's really where it should sit. And if it doesn't sit there, that means it's an unbankable project. And clearly that's something that investors, as you've heard right now, are facing within Kenya. So the lesson, I think, one of the lessons from Lake Turkana, there are many lessons, is where you've managed to bank a very large, complicated project, then for all parties really, not deviating from that risk allocation package is probably your best way to secure the next project. And sadly, we don't see that, and not just in Eastern Africa, but across the continent, where lessons are not learned, and that's a real shame, I think. The other thing I'd say on geothermal, I mean, Ethiopia is another great example. The Korbeti geothermal project, which we've been advising on, but has been going on for a large number of years. Fortunately, now in a position where the PPA and implementation agreement are very close to being approved and signed by government, but it has taken quite a while to get there. There's another project, Tulamoye, which is coming on, hopefully will be the second large geothermal project. Again, these are not gone through a kind of an open tender process. They're projects that have been done on a sort of bilateral negotiation basis with government, and regulatory structures almost have had to be put in place after the fact. And with IFC scaling solar in country as well, there are lots of different kind of procurement methods for renewable in Ethiopia. But the large-scale projects can still be done, very much so. But getting that risk allocation right in your documents, in your government document, in your PPA is absolutely crucial. And for all the talk, I think that lesson, that message needs to be repeated time and time again.
Yeah.
A question.
Sorry. Yeah, I totally agree with you. But one of the points that I would like to raise is that why we had in this industry so many delays. And the realities in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania are pretty different. And a lot of delays, they've been caused because, let's say, the difficulties to secure the land, especially in Kenya. Yeah. So this is not eventually a problem that you might face in Ethiopia and Tanzania because the land, it's government-owned, basically. So I think there are two different realities. And also I wanted to make the point, following your comment, Christian, is where we should go, or where these tendering processes, they should arrive. Should the government allocate the land, and let's say the different sponsor or players, they should bid for that specific location, or the industry, for example, in Kenya, there have been many developments that they were not successful, and eventually give them the opportunity to do a kind of re-IPP program like in South Africa. So, but the land issue, I think, and maybe, I mean, from the legal perspective, you know very well, is a big concern, because also each country has different realities, and even inside the country, the different regions and tribes, they might cause problems in order to get those servitudes and so on. So
yeah, that's true.
Agreed.
Good.
I was just trying to raise a question for clarification. Now, the project that you are doing in Naivasha, Olkaria, you're saying that
Akira, sorry.
Yeah, but these projects, before you start them, don't you have an agreement with the government to specify specifically how much the government is supposed to contribute? Because you're saying it's being delayed because the government is not contributing what they're supposed to contribute, or is a figure that you've just given them?
Well, so
is it there in the planning before you start the project? Are you saying the government you are going to contribute so many billion shillings or dollars, whatever, so that the government is aware that as this project starts, our contribution is so much?
But the government contribution to this project is zero. It's a pure IPP feed-in tariff-based project. Yeah. There's a private geothermal concession which gives rights to a PPA, which has been signed. It also gives rights to a GOK support letter and everything else. The problem is that, not everything has fallen into place. So, these things are getting delayed because, government is not able to issue the GOK support letter that will unlock the financing. Not financing from government, but our financing on our side. And it's not that we don't sympathize. I think we really sympathize with the position of the Kenyan government on this, because, as much as we can be very nerdy about the legal nitty-gritties of this, the perception is that, well, we've been pulled into arbitration very recently because of this. You know, we really need to make sure that we're not making the same mistake again, and we can understand that. But in the absence of that, it's holding back a lot of projects, which is quite problematic.
Or that your financiers would like to have government guarantee or something?
Well, it's a support in respect of several things. You know, in terms of political interference in the project, which is for easy one. It's also in respect of political interference in respect of KenGen, which is majority government owned. There's certain standard provisions which are within the control of government, and you know that are in Uganda, for instance. This is a standard. It's called an implementation agreement, but it effectively covers the same thing. In Rwanda, it's called a concession agreement, which effectively covers the same things. And I think in the past in Kenya, these have been issued. And it's not, we're not objecting to reviewing some of the very specific things that have given rise to some recent events. But I think, yeah, there are a lot of things being stalled because of this specific thing. And it's not only our project. There are maybe 4, 5 very mature projects in Kenya right now, only waiting for this thing to sort of be resolved.
Okay.
Okay, before we focus a bit on Tanzania and Ethiopia, I would just like to see if there are any questions from the audience. There's one over there.
I can shout, it's very loud because he's on.
Okay.
We have a recording, so we perhaps to speak in this one. Hi, it's Paul Biggs from Trinity. Just one comment in respect of the GOK letter, I think, and kind of directed to the Commissioner. I think the one thing we would like to note to the Government of Kenya, Kenya Power and ERC as well, is Kenya actually has got the best deal in terms of allocation of risk in the region. We started doing IPPs in Kenya since Rabai, and we worked on Olkaria and Kinangop and Kapetu and Turkana. Of all of the countries, in terms of allocation of risk, the GOK letter actually, just to clarify, it's not comparable with the other implementation agreements. For the government, it's better. Now, credit to Kenya, it negotiated that deal on Rabai, and the lenders and investors actually hated it, but deals got done. And credit to Kenya then, and in particular a lady who isn't here, Laurenti Nyagi at Kenya Power, it was one example where the country itself developed that precedent structure. So you didn't reinvent the wheel for a number of years. You therefore got deals done relatively quickly. So you almost created the equivalent of what we've created on GetFit and everything else, because you didn't reinvent the wheel, which worked for you. It got deals done. And that's the frustration Daniel and others now are sharing, in that you are now trying to reinvent the wheel. But it is something you need to appreciate, that it's a wheel which was already genuinely really good for you. So anyway, thank you.
Good, thank you for that comment. Then let's move to Tanzania. I think that's clearly, I think, one of the more challenging frameworks we are looking at right now. It's not really clear how the combination with TANESCO and there, I mean, great hesitation to provide any kind of support letter from the government side, in combination with further arrears on PPA payments, even like termination of PPAs, how that will ever lead to anything bankable for, well, the renewable projects which are there. I can speak for some of the wind sites there. They are spectacular, right? You have 10 meters second sites and so on. It's world-class wind resources, but not really any clarity how that will be able to be financed, right? Maybe Christian. I mean, I know Globeleq is a big player, a big part of the Tanzanian energy mix. How do we make sense of that?
I'm going to break my mother's rule. Well, we do operate in Nsongas, which is about 25% of the grid's power. It's very cheap. It was a project originally developed at AES, where I once was a long time ago, and as you may know, it incorporates a gas field and the pipeline and the power plant. So it's quite another unicorn in that manner of speaking. And it's a project where there have been issues with arrears. They are being paid down slowly, mostly because we have the leverage of shutting the units off, which we have done on a couple of occasions. So that we have a repayment plan that's working, which is great for us. We're looking to expand that facility further. But there are cross subsidies in the market. It's an unhealthy market. You don't have a cost-reflective tariff. So without that tariff being set at the right, as efficient as TANESCO can get, you're still going to have a shortage on paying for generation. That's one major issue. The other major issue is a few IPPs that were not necessarily done very well are in disputes, have been ordered, so a lot of chaos there, a lot of non-payments. And then overarching that, quite frankly, are donors coming in and giving TANESCO the money to build their own power plants, like Kinyerezi, which I think is very 1970s, very old school, very inefficient, bad use of capital, bad use of allocation of risk. And I think some of the Tanzanians keep hoping that more of this soft money is going to come so they can avoid the IPP market and keep building their own power plants. They've got great ambitions, there's great need, there's great resources. So it's, I hate to pick favorites, but it's very interesting to look at the two countries, Kenya and Tanzania, next to themselves. All you can say about Tanzania is there's tremendous potential. There'll be a new minister coming in. Will there be more room for the IPPs? At the moment, it doesn't look good.
Dan?
I can maybe add just a little silver lining to that. On the small scale side, we are actually sort of reasonably optimistic that there are some, good things happening in terms of, especially on the standardized PPA side, that we're getting close to an SPPA for small scale projects, modeled very much on sort of the Ugandan case and some of the good Kenyan PPAs. And that has been going on with quite a lot of involvement from the regulator and all the stakeholders, and that actually seems to be coming to a favorable conclusion.
And is there a government support package element?
That is part of it, yeah.
Part of that.
I think my colleague has a lot more intelligent things to say about that, but that's at least our assessment of the situation. Yeah.
In Tanzania,
but it doesn't. Of course, it doesn't solve the problem that TANESCO isn't like making a profit. That's overarching.
Yes. Beyond the SPPA program, there has also, of course, been discussion on the large-scale tender that is a little bit on hold. I think it's also because of the support letter question. Koshak, what would be your advice? I mean, how can they structure that with the TANESCO topic that has been mentioned? I mean, how can they reach bankability there?
I mean, there are certain key. I mean, encouraged to hear that the small-scale PPAs, which I know have been in development for quite a while, are now reaching some kind of conclusion. It is comforting to hear. We've been involved in a wind farm on behalf of a client for many years. That's ongoing, and it really is the government support package that's missing. And as we sort of discussed and Paul from the audience mentioned, that government support package, it does vary, and it has a number of elements. One element is, which the Commissioner referred to, is a guarantee. It's a payment backup from central government for the off-takers' obligations in two events, really, in the event that the IPP remains unpaid over a certain period of time, and secondly, in the event that that non-payment then leads to termination, and then there's a compensation element. But that's effectively a sovereign guarantee, which in a number of countries may need parliamentary approval, all the way along the line down to something that's as simple as a letter of comfort. The Kenyan letter of support probably falls somewhere along that spectrum, closer towards the letter of comfort. And a letter of comfort can be a very much simple 1 or 2 page letter from the government that we're going to support the sector. We're not going to change our laws relating to the sector in a discriminatory manner. And sort of somewhere in the middle is probably the ideal place, and an ideal place that's a fair risk allocation between government and private investors, and something that's bankable. And so those key elements are some kind of certainty on payment, termination compensation, protection from change in law, particularly if it's unfavorable change in law or discriminatory change in law. And then the big one really is political risk. And what's going to be very interesting, and Kenya is a good example, is how do you define that political risk? Because I think we all understand what that really means, but when you try and drill down to the details, does it mean that if you've got protesters on site, or there's a local MP or a local councillor who manages to rabble-rouse and get people on site, is that something that central government should be taking on? Possibly yes, because there are police forces and there are elements that are in control of central government that can help solve those. But that's actually, when you get to the detail, actually that becomes quite challenging. But somewhere on that spectrum, I think, is where Tanzania and where countries need to end up. Uganda is probably the implementation agreement is pretty good. Includes economic stabilization provisions, thresholds for change in law. It's a much more sort of thought through and complicated document. But there certainly is a spectrum, and projects get bankable across the spectrum.
Thanks. Okay, let's move a bit further up north then. Ethiopia, huge potential in various renewable sources. Maybe to start on the geothermal side, what do you see there, Anthony?
Well, I think we're all aware of the current tenders that are being, or sorry, the current concessions which are being developed in Ethiopia. So Ethiopia is the great potential now for geothermal, for new geothermal in the region. And I think it will be a very exciting period over the next few years, medium, sort of 5-year term, to see if those projects get developed successfully. My understanding is the country doesn't have a specific feed-in tariff for the geothermal resources there. So I understand that it's down to each individual concession holder to negotiate that. And I'd be interested in people's comments as to whether they think that's a reasonable way to develop these projects.
I can simply say we're, after my Tanzania downer, we're very excited about the prospects of Ethiopia. We're seeing a real political will there, compounded by a real necessity to turn to IPP markets. The learning curve is steep, as we've discussed in all these countries, but I think there is a real intent there to get it right on geothermal. As I mentioned, we bid for solar. We've got some wind proposals in front of government. The geothermal price, I think there is a de facto price. I think we'll see, whoever else is there, and we're looking at something ourselves, will have to match what's Corbetti. And I think the hope is within Ethiopia, and certainly the rhetoric is, we will take the lessons learned, the hard-fought lessons from the Corbetti team, and we will replicate those in other projects. So we think there's a tremendous potential in Ethiopia, and certainly a place where we're spending a fair amount of time.
Yeah, I do agree also with you, Grace. So we recently, we were in the process of opening a commercial office in Ethiopia. I mean, I think it's a medium-term investment or challenge. So now we have, Metahara, Mekele, and Humera, those tenders. But from our side, at least, we are looking for the release of the scaling solar pre-qualification, then the RFP, and see also how, let's say, the local government and EEP is trying also together with us to learn how to let's say, to be successful with those programs. But one of the things that I mean, regardless of talking about Ethiopia, Tanzania, or Kenya, I think for the industry it's very important to, if there is a tender process, I think the governments, they want cheap and reliable energy on time. So, and as sponsors, what we need is to be able to do a business plan, to forecast what we might do in those countries. So I think it's important to create an industry. So if there is a tender process, I would encourage the governments to at least, either if it's if they put the sites, wind or solar, or if they do a kind of ReIPP program in South Africa, is to give the opportunity to have more than one winner. Because I think, I mean, sometimes there are, in the world actually, different tenders that if there is only one winner, sometimes it's difficult because, you know, the interests of the different sponsors are not the same. Yeah. So I think it's pretty, regardless of the size of the projects, I think it's important to create an industry since the starting point in 2, 3, 4 years. And I think it would help the competition, the knowledge of the technologies, and I think this is a very important thing.
Yeah, I agree.
Also, if I may, I had a question really for Daniel, Christian, and Anunay, and that any developer in Ethiopia specifically is how developers see dealing with the currency risk, both in terms of convertibility and probably more, you know, linked with convertibility is just the availability of US dollars in the market, given that you'll be paid in beer. Is that how from a developer's perspective, are you hoping to address that?
Okay, we must say that we didn't tender. We were pre-qualified for example, for Metahara, but obviously I think most of the sponsors in Ethiopia and in other places that we are facing this type of, let's say, risk, I think now also. So we are looking for the mega guarantees and these kind of packages coming from the World Bank that are also part of this scaling solar package that they can eventually mitigate that risk. Then it's on the sponsor to make the decisions if it's enough or not. But
yeah, I would say we've obviously, this is the nut to crack. And I think it's important to stress it's not really Ethiopia's fault. No. To a large extent, that's the nature of their economy. I guess a couple of things. One, there are obviously some clever lawyers involved in the first set of documents because I think it's important to clarify it's a liquidity issue for sure, but it's not a depreciation issue. No. So it's a timing of getting your bear into dollars as opposed to sitting with BER that's just losing value. So it's a time value issue, an important one. But that, I think, in of itself is a big step in the right direction. You can get priority, but how many, if you make this an industry, how many people can you give priority to? We are finding ways to deal with that. We are very interested in the ATI KfW facility. Can that be expanded and applied? This is like one big Trinity plug, isn't it? It is. We're talking to PRG Mega. Can they do something? I mean, to me, there's a will, there's a way. There's a lot of people who want to solve the problem. There's a lot of understanding. We're jumping in with the faith that we can solve it. If not, we have modeled scenarios where we get the money out late and we live with a lower return. But we have a very long-term view of the country. We keep our equity in for the full 20 years. So it's a risk we're willing to take with some degree of trepidation.
Yes. Yeah, I'm clueless on Ethiopia, so that was not what I wanted to comment on. It was more in terms of, let's say, I think one of the key issues in all the countries has been that there have been a lot of not serious developers hawking a lot of good sites for a very long time. And there is a real problem from the side of authorities and anybody to distinguish who are serious and who are not serious. And basically sort of coming up with a good objective way of judging, you know, because maybe you can discount 2/3 of all the projects that have expressions of interest in Kenya or feasibility study permits in Uganda or, you know, whatever it is in the other countries, whether it's an MOU or something. And one of the things we have actually sort of tried to encourage regulators and ministries and so on to insist upon is performance bonds. Because in our view, that is one of the best ways of sort of, you know, given that you don't have perfect information, well, if somebody can place a bond for some amount, let's say $100,000 or $50,000 or some amount that would actually matter a little bit, then you discourage sort of opportunists from just taking a good natural resource and sitting on it until somebody comes in and pays them a lot of money to sell it. And I think a lot of the pipeline is stuck in that let's say, position where there are a lot of people that are not really pushing the projects, they're sitting on them and expecting a windfall. And it's also a challenge when we talk about transitioning potentially to a tender, because obviously you would want the people that have actually invested in the development to maybe have a different track and not just lose the entire investment because it's going to a different. But at the same time, you want to exclude the ones that haven't really performed. Yeah, it's a really tough one to crack.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and it just the same actually also applies to Ethiopia. I mean, we have heard from the government of Ethiopia that they had great frustration with in the old structure where developers went in, they got MOUs on some of the sites, but not much really happening or not much progress being seen by the government. I think that's also probably one of the reasons why they, at least on large-scale wind, are still thinking about, well, maybe going away from the IPP route altogether, giving it to EEP. Christian makes the comment for Tanzania, right? I mean, then having this Kinyarezi project, 1970s, I think you called it. Talking to the Ethiopian government, I mean, on the other hand, we should not forget that. I can see how IPPs, of course, do not find that an attractive structure, obviously. But on the other side, there are Chinese suppliers, and they call it BOT model, or they even call it EPCF, right? You have an EPC supplier that brings the financing package with them. That's very nice, right? The state-owned utility just needs to sign and take on the constructed power plant after construction, right? It's a nice model, but it's also a little bit, I think, a challenge for the business models that we are working on here. And to me, I mean, the jury is still out which way, at least for the wind part, Ethiopia will then in the end go, right? If it will actually, via the scaling solar and so on, move more into the IPP direction, or if it turns into something different, really.
I would just very quickly add that even the EPCF, which sounds profane, but it also requires government guarantees. And I think it's not a foolish structure. It just requires more sovereign debt exposure. So quite frankly, it is the easier way. Project finance is a pain. Everybody hates it, including myself, but it's the best form of finance to do a lot of deals across difficult markets. So I think for this reason, I think we and the EPCF approach requiring guarantees, I still believe IPPs will be the future for Ethiopia. We'll see.
And somebody still needs to develop the projects.
Yeah,
I mean,
indeed.
fundamentally, which is a key constraining factor in the market, I think.
Absolutely, yes. Good. Our time is, slowly ending up here. Any questions from the audience right now? There's one here in the front.
There's someone up there, yeah.
Oh, okay. Let's take that one first. After that,
thank you. I think, first of all, my name is Joshua Ogwal. I'm a lawyer in the energy space in Uganda. I think, first of all, as a Ugandan, just to be patriotic, or to at least sound patriotic, I would like to differ with the gentleman who said that Kenya's letter of allocation, Kenya's government of Kenya letter has the best risk allocation structure. I think the implementation argument in Uganda is quite excellent, actually almost intuitive from an investor perspective. The risk allocation is properly modeled on the basis of the GetFit negotiations that took place. So I think that's just the way to settle. With respect to the issue that was raised regarding permits being hawked by a couple of errant individuals, I think what's being done in Uganda is there's now a strong policy by the authority, the power regulator, to ensure that you have a use it or lose it approach. Instituting bonds at the permit stage is a bit may be seen to be a bit onerous because
you
a
do
person
that in
hasn't
Uganda.
Sorry?
You do have bonds in Uganda?
We do have bonds, but when you get a license.
No?
You do have bonds, but when you get a license.
Also,
the regulator has moved more towards doing a due diligence on the guys who are trying to apply for the license to ensure that more credible people can come in. So they do a due diligence and only require the bond if they are not certain of your financial capability. So you provide, your previous financial statements, documents that demonstrate credibility based on your past experience. If you provide that, a bond nowadays may not be required. So that's just something that, I'll probably highlight. Thanks.
If I could just respond just on the point about the support letter, I think Paul's point was that from a government perspective, the government of Kenya support letter is a better package. I agree fully that the Ugandan implementation agreement, from a general, whether you're a risk allocation perspective, whether you're a banker, whether you're a developer, whether you're government, it's a much better package. I think Paul's point was actually Kenya, in a sense, you've got off lightly with what you already had. To roll back from something that's already relatively light is making it even more challenging.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, there was one question here in the front.
It's more of a comment than a question. My name is Mesfin. I'm from Ethiopia, and I represent Mesfin Tamas and Associates Law Office. We are involved in the midst of this process in Ethiopia in the power sector. We have been assisting the public-private partnership law that's being almost is going to be enacted soon. And we have also been involved in the IFC scaling solar project, working as a transaction advisor with IFC, local part. We have also assisted with a bid for the Matara project for one of the 5 shortlisted companies. So we are very much involved. The Ethiopia's challenge from our perspective is one critically institutional coordination between the various government institutions involved in the process. You start from the Ministry of Finance and Economic Cooperation, which is responsible for policy as well as regulatory and high-level legal issues, very, very challenged in terms of personnel. You have the National Bank, which is dealing with all forex issues, all government institutions. If you talk about forex issues, they always lead to the NBE, which is a very strict regulator because of the scarcity of the resources. I agree. It's more of a question of availability as opposed to depreciation, liquidity as opposed to depreciation. There is also institutionally EEP, Ethiopian Electric Power, which is really suddenly challenged with lots of IPPs, ongoing IPPs, new IPPs, and very much challenged on a technical front. All this, there is also Ministry of Energy, which is also responsible for policy. So you have coordination issues at this point. Another is also a question of capacity as well. And there are also certain rules in relation to, for example, security that have to be updated, be in line with current reality. So in spite of all these challenges, of course, there are so many opportunities. And the government's political will, as indicated there, is really very determined in terms of bringing about changes in the sector. I just want to share my experience and comments.
Okay, very good. Thank you for that comment. I think our time is up. Thank you very much, everybody on the panel and also in the audience for coming for the good discussion. I think it has been becoming quite clear. I mean, the huge potential that we're seeing in East Africa, but also some of the challenge in terms of reaching bankability, in terms of timing. I think one of the silver linings or the answers lies in the right procurement setups. We heard some good examples. There's no one size fits all. There needs to be tailored procurement solutions. I mean, we have discussed scaling solar, GetFit, bilateral negotiations and so on. It needs to be the right for the scale, for the technology. More needs to be done on acceleration. And I think that's very important, that some of the lessons learned from successful projects that we've seen in geothermal, in wind, in solar and so on are not getting lost, and that we also get maybe the banks involved more early to really also lend their advice to the governments. What will then be a bankable framework in the end, right? And I think that's the recipe of scaling solar and GetFit. Maybe there's more that can be done also in some of the countries where that is not in place yet. I'm sure Koshak will be happy to support with his expertise there, and I think that alone can save us many years of reaching financial close and some of the very promising projects that are out there. With that, I'll wrap up. Thank you very much, and see you next time. Bye-bye.